7:12 a.m. November 3rd, 1942. MiG Alley, along the Yalu River. The sky was the color of cold steel, a flat gray sheet that swallowed the horizon. Lieutenant Yuri Sokolov banked his MiG-15 hard to the right, the silver wings slicing through the thin cloud layer. Vapor trails peeled off his wingtips long, ghost-white fingers stretching behind him, just like the photographs Soviet intelligence used for training. His cockpit shook violently as he pushed the throttle forward. The needle trembled, the engine whined. Somewhere behind the veil of clouds, an F-86 Sabre was closing in. Yuri couldn't see it. He could only feel it. A burst of static ripped through his headset. "Sokolov, Sabre at your 4 o'clock closing fast. Brake now." He snapped the stick left, but the horizon didn't tilt the way he expected. The aircraft hesitated just a fraction of a second, but enough to raise every hair on the back of his neck. MiG-15 manuals warned about this. At high speed, the aircraft resisted abrupt rolls. Soviet doctrine was clear: keep the fight vertical, climb and dive. Never let the Sabre pull you into a horizontal turn. But today, something was wrong. The Sabres weren't just chasing them. They were predicting them. Last week, 3 pilots from Yuri's regiment had been caught by the same impossible shot lead bursts that struck exactly where their MiG would appear half a second later. Soviet officers blamed pilot error, radar interference, even bad American luck. But Yuri knew better. As he leveled out, contrails swirling behind him, he caught a flicker of sunlight off metal low, behind his belly. A Sabre had rolled beneath him, sliding into the perfect firing angle, as if it had read his next move. That shouldn't be possible. Not with this speed. Not with this bank angle. Not with any gunsight the Americans were known to have. Yuri's breath froze in his throat. How did he know? He whispered. Moments later, the sky erupted behind him, short, controlled bursts, perfectly timed. Not wild spray. Not panic fire. Calculated. Yuri pulled hard, straining against the G-forces, but deep down he felt it. The Sabres had something new, something hidden, something the MiGs were never trained to fight, and it was about to change the balance of MiG Alley forever. The thin light of early morning slipped across the Yalu River as Yuri steadied his breathing and scanned the empty gray horizon stretching endlessly ahead of him. The northern bank, still untouched by winter snow, blended into the low cloud deck so perfectly that distance became an illusion, turning the entire battlefield into a shifting haze of silver and ash. MiG Alley had always been unforgiving, but today it felt strangely alive, as if the air itself were waiting for something to happen. Soviet controllers believed altitude would give their pilots the advantage, yet the Sabres kept slipping into firing positions no one could predict or explain. Below Yuri's flight path, the river twisted like a dark blade between two worlds. Chinese sanctuary on one side, American hunting ground on the other, forcing every pilot to fight within a narrow corridor that punished even the smallest mistake. The MiG-15 seconds were faster at high altitude and climbed like rockets, but their thick wings resisted abrupt rolls, especially when the air grew dense near the mid-altitude bands where most engagements actually unfolded. Sabre pilots knew this weakness intimately, and Yuri could almost feel them circling just outside his field of view, waiting for him to commit to a turn he couldn't escape. His regiment, the 324th IAD, had launched 12 fighters that morning, but the formation fractured quickly once they entered the cloud banks stretching across the combat zone. Radio interference had grown worse over the past week, filling every channel with bursts of static that drowned out commands and left each pilot effectively alone. Controllers pushed the MiGs to maintain altitude superiority, but American patrol patterns had shifted, trapping Soviet pilots in unpredictable cross angles that nullified their textbook maneuvers. It was as if the Sabres already knew where every MiG would appear long before the fight even began. Yuri rolled slightly to adjust his heading, watching the contrails peel away in long white ribbons that faded into the mist almost instantly. He remembered instructors describing contrails as both shield and curse, useful for tracking wingmen but fatal when an enemy with sharper reaction time used them to plot interceptions. The Sabres rarely left visible trails at this altitude, leaving Soviet pilots guessing at their true position until it was far too late to respond effectively. Far to the west, flashes of sunlight broke through a thin gap in the clouds, illuminating the subtle curve of the valley where most duels erupted without warning. From that altitude, Yuri could see the fractured geometry of the battlefield, narrow lanes of approach, overlapping radar coverage, and invisible barriers formed by political boundaries that both sides respected in theory but violated in the heat of combat. Every engagement in MiG Alley was shaped by these constraints, compressing speed, altitude, and surprise into a deadly equation that punished hesitation with brutal finality. As Yuri eased the throttle back to stabilize his approach, he felt the weight of the mission settle across his shoulders with chilling clarity. The Americans were flying differently this month. Cleaner turns, tighter bursts, more precise timing, and rumors of a new Gunsight mod rippled through Soviet ready rooms like a quiet storm no one wanted to acknowledge openly. Yuri didn't know what the Sabres were using, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. If he didn't understand their advantage soon, MiG Alley would no longer belong to the MiGs. Yuri leveled his MiG and felt the familiar stiffness ripple through the airframe, a subtle resistance that always appeared when he tried to correct his roll at high speed. The instructors had warned that the MiG-15's swept wings created extraordinary lift, but introduced a stubborn hesitation during abrupt lateral movements, especially in the dense mid-altitude air where most real engagements occurred. He knew this delay well, yet what unsettled him now was how perfectly the Sabres seemed to exploit it, striking at the exact moment his aircraft paused between intention and reaction. The official Soviet doctrine insisted that pilots maintain vertical maneuvering superiority, relying on the MiG's powerful climb rate to dictate the pace of the fight, yet these textbook tactics were failing with increasing regularity. American fighters no longer chased them upward or attempted reckless dives. Instead, they waited for predictable Soviet movements, intercepting from angles that bypassed the MiG's greatest strengths and exposed its overlooked vulnerabilities. Yuri suspected the flaw lay in the doctrine itself, which treated every engagement as a clean geometry problem rather than a fluid duel shaped by timing, instinct, and information the manuals never mentioned. Recent reports from fellow pilots described situations that seemed almost impossible, with Sabres rolling inside MiG turns at moments when physics should have denied them any such advantage. The pattern repeated too often to dismiss as coincidence. Yet the regiment commanders insisted the Americans were simply flying more aggressively, rather than benefiting from hidden technology. Yuri disagreed, because he had watched several engagements unfold with eerie precision, each one revealing the same chilling detail. The Sabres fired not at where the MiG currently was, but exactly where it would appear, after the slight roll delay completed. As he descended slightly to escape the cloud layer, Yuri replayed his last encounter in his mind, noting the exact instant the Sabre pilot fired a short controlled burst that aligned perfectly with the arc of his impending turn. It was as if the American had a window into the future, predicting the completion of Yuri's maneuver with uncanny accuracy that no ordinary gun sight should allow. Soviet intelligence had dismissed rumors of advanced American targeting systems, claiming the Sabre used conventional lead computing mechanisms inferior to their own equipment, but Yuri knew the battlefield rarely respected official assessments. The deeper problem, he realized, was that Soviet doctrine treated the MiG-15 as a flawless machine, assuming its superior climb rate and raw speed made it invulnerable to clever countermeasures. This rigid belief left pilots unprepared for scenarios where the enemy adapted faster than the textbooks allowed, transforming every doctrinal weakness into a weapon the opposing side could exploit relentlessly. Yuri felt a wave of frustration creeping through him as he pictured his instructors lecturing about ideal maneuvers performed under perfect laboratory conditions rather than in the chaotic air corridors of MiG Alley. He steadied his aircraft again, thinking about how many comrades had fallen because they trusted procedures that no longer matched reality, and he understood with sharp clarity that something invisible was tipping the balance. Whether it was a mechanical modification, a new optical trick, or an unconventional field adjustment, the Americans possessed an advantage the Soviet manuals never accounted for. Until that mystery was solved, every duel in MiG Alley would begin with the MiGs already one step behind, fighting ghosts armed with timing no human reflex should possess. Yuri tightened his grip on the control stick as he slipped beneath another shallow cloud shelf, recalling how every Soviet training lecture had emphasized strict adherence to maneuver doctrine rather than flexible judgment shaped by battlefield intuition. The instructors at Andong had drilled into each pilot a rigid sequence of vertical maneuvers meant to exploit the MiG's impressive climb rate, repeatedly insisting that altitude superiority alone could neutralize any tactical surprise the Americans attempted. Those lessons felt absolute during simulations, yet the unforgiving reality of MiG Alley revealed gaps that widened each month, exposing pilots to ambush angles the manuals never addressed. During classroom sessions, diagrams filled entire chalkboards with beautifully clean arcs, showing how a MiG-15 should outclimb or outturn an F-86, but none of those sketches accounted for cloud turbulence, radio interference, or the split-second hesitation built into the MiG's roll response. Yuri remembered the instructors praising the aircraft's lightweight controls and superior thrust, though they rarely mentioned how those same features produced unstable handling during abrupt transitions between vertical and horizontal engagement phases. The manuals described perfect geometry, yet the battlefield cared only about timing, instinct, and the hidden quirks of metal pushed to its limits. He thought back to a demonstration flight where the lead instructor performed a steep dive, followed by a high-speed roll meant to illustrate the MiG's agility, though several trainees noticed a faint lag in the roll axis that the instructor casually dismissed as pilot inexperience. In training, such hesitation seemed trivial because no one was firing back, but in real combat, those fractions of a second created a deadly opening that Sabre pilots were beginning to exploit with unnerving consistency. The manuals encouraged confidence in the MiG's strengths, while glossing over the subtle imperfections that only emerged under extreme stress, leaving pilots dangerously unprepared against opponents who studied those flaws with meticulous focus. Yuri realized the Americans were fighting a different kind of war, approaching each encounter with adaptive tactics that threw Soviet doctrine into disarray by undermining assumptions that had gone unchallenged for far too long. Sabre pilots never followed predictable vertical patterns and instead used sweeping lateral angles that manipulated the MiG's sluggish roll transitions, forcing Soviet pilots into disadvantageous positions before they even recognized the tactical trap being set. This shift suggested the Americans were guided by insights that went beyond ordinary gunsight computation, revealing a deeper understanding of how small delays shaped aerial duels at high closing speeds. The more Yuri analyzed these discrepancies, the clearer it became that Soviet doctrine had unintentionally trained its pilots to be predictable, leaving them trapped within a framework the Americans had already deciphered and systematically countered. Each engagement that ended poorly for the MiGs hinted at an unseen mechanism assisting the Sabres, something granting them the uncanny ability to anticipate movements with mechanical precision that no human reflex could consistently replicate. The manuals taught Soviet pilots to trust procedure above intuition, but the skies of MiG Alley rewarded improvisation, awareness, and the ability to adapt instantly when theory diverged from reality. As Yuri adjusted his altitude once more, he felt the weight of this realization settle with quiet inevitability, understanding that the doctrine intended to protect him had instead become a subtle liability. If the Americans possessed a hidden advantage that magnified every doctrinal gap, then no amount of textbook discipline could compensate for the vulnerability it exposed. The thought stayed with him like a cold shadow, reminding him that the next encounter might not simply test his skills, but challenge the very foundations of everything he had been taught to trust. Yuri eased the throttle forward as his MiG sliced through a clearing in the clouds, and in that brief stretch of open sky, he felt the aircraft's subtle resistance again, a faint mechanical hesitation that seemed harmless during training, yet became alarmingly predictable under real combat stress. The delay felt small, barely a thin breath of mechanical lag, but Sabre pilots appeared to sense it with uncanny precision, as if they measured the stall between intention and execution more accurately than any Soviet engineer believed possible. He had long suspected that this microscopic pause concealed a deeper vulnerability, one buried not in doctrine, but in the very mechanics of the MiG-15 itself. The aircraft's hydraulic system delivered impressive power, but its roll response had a narrow sweet spot that vanished the moment a pilot demanded rapid adjustments at high speed or during low-altitude engagements. This quirk rarely mattered during training flights, where smooth maneuvers and predictable air conditions minimized stress on the control surfaces, yet in MiG Alley every second was shaped by turbulence, wind shear, and abrupt transitions that revealed imperfections normally hidden beneath ideal test scenarios. Yuri understood now that these inconsistencies created a small but fatal pattern, allowing Sabre pilots to time their attacks with a precision the Soviet manuals never anticipated. He remembered a briefing weeks earlier where a maintenance officer mentioned that several MiG-15 seconds returned from combat with unusual wear patterns on the lateral control linkages, suggesting that the repeated stress from abrupt rolls was generating micro-delays the pilots rarely recognized consciously. The officer dismissed the phenomenon as normal fatigue caused by high-performance flying, but Yuri realized those tiny lags translated directly into predictable openings that an observant enemy could exploit. If the Americans had discovered this through battlefield analysis or instrument recordings, then every MiG maneuver could be anticipated seconds before it actually happened. What troubled Yuri more was the growing evidence that the Sabres were not merely reacting faster, but reacting before Soviet pilots completed their movements, as if aided by a device that minimized their own mechanical delays and processed lead angles instantly. Soviet engineers believed the American Gunsight was inferior because it relied on older gyroscopic principles, yet recent encounters contradicted every assumption, revealing firing patterns far too precise to be the result of instinct alone. Yuri suspected the Americans had modified their Gunsight without public documentation, creating an unseen advantage that recalibrated the timing of every engagement. As he descended through another cloud bank, the scattered memory of a downed MiG pilot's final report resurfaced in Yuri's mind, describing how the Sabre's bursts aligned perfectly with the MiG's predicted roll arc, even though the pilot had attempted an unconventional escape maneuver not taught in Soviet manuals. That chilling consistency suggested the Americans were not tracking the MiG's position, but its future position, relying on a mechanism capable of erasing the guesswork normally required in fast-moving dogfights. Such precision exceeded human reflexes, implying the presence of a hidden device that translated minute aircraft movements into instantly calculated firing solutions. The more Yuri considered these clues, the clearer the pattern became, revealing a chain of mechanical vulnerabilities that Soviet doctrine had unintentionally ignored for far too long. The MiG-15 was a masterpiece of raw power and high-altitude performance, yet beneath its sleek exterior lay several overlooked limitations that sharpened into liabilities whenever enemy pilots discovered how to exploit them. If the Americans had truly eliminated the smallest delays in their targeting system, then the balance of MiG Alley was already shifting, and no amount of altitude or speed could compensate for an unseen advantage that rewrote the rhythm of aerial combat. The realization settled over Yuri like a tightening frost, reminding him that the danger he faced was not merely the Sabre behind him, but an invisible flaw hidden within his own aircraft, one the Americans had already learned to weaponize with devastating efficiency. While Yuri wrestled with the hidden weaknesses of his MiG, American pilots across the valley had begun piecing together a pattern that changed the rhythm of every engagement. During early patrols, several Sabre pilots noticed how MiG-15 seconds consistently executed a distinctive bank angle just before committing to any major maneuver, a subtle motion triggered by the aircraft's aerodynamic design rather than the pilot's conscious decision. This slight belly tilt, almost invisible at high speeds, introduced a fractional pause that repeated with mechanical precision, turning the MiG's approach into a predictable sequence rather than a fluid improvisation. At first, Sabre pilots attributed this consistency to Soviet training habits, believing their opponents were simply following rigid textbook procedures taught by instructors who prized discipline over creativity. However, one squadron began documenting these recurring movements using gun camera footage, analyzing frame-by-frame changes in the MiG's orientation to understand why these angles appeared before every escape attempt. The recordings revealed something far more valuable than a doctrinal pattern. They exposed the exact moment when the MiG's roll hesitation reached its peak, creating a perfect window for a well-timed burst. This discovery became the foundation of a new tactical approach, encouraging Sabre pilots to anticipate the MiG's future position rather than react to its current one. By watching for the micro-tilt that preceded every turn, Sabre pilots learned to fire just before the maneuver completed, allowing their rounds to intersect with the path the MiG would enter half a second later. Such timing demanded extraordinary precision, yet the hidden Gunsight modification eliminated the Sabre's own mechanical delays, aligning the weapon's response with the pilot's instincts so seamlessly that the aircraft felt directly connected to the pilot's thoughts. As the technique spread through the squadron, pilots began experimenting with different angles and distances, gradually refining their ability to exploit the MiG's predictable hesitation. Engagements that once ended in chaotic rolling duels now unfolded as carefully timed intercepts, with Sabres drifting into attack positions that seemed impossible to counter because they were launched before the MiG could fully execute its evasive arc. The Americans soon realized they no longer needed to match the MiG's raw climbing strength or superior high-altitude performance. Instead, they only needed to understand the rhythm of its movements and strike the instant its mechanical weaknesses surfaced. One pilot described the sensation as reading the MiG's mind, though the truth lay in the interplay between human intuition and a finely tuned gunsight that erased the guesswork from aerial combat. The modification amplified the smallest visual cues, turning each faint wing tilt into a reliable indicator of the MiG's next action, and Sabre pilots quickly developed an instinctive feel for these patterns. With each successful engagement, the squadron refined their understanding further, building a collective knowledge base that transformed the hidden Gunsight from a mechanical advantage into a strategic weapon. By late autumn, the technique had spread across multiple wings, and Sabre pilots entering MiG Alley did so with a quiet confidence shaped not by bravado, but by the certainty that they possessed an insight their opponents did not. The battlefield that once favored altitude and speed now rewarded timing and anticipation, and every MiG that hesitated even slightly paid the price for a flaw buried deep within its design. As Yuri continued his patrol, unaware of how precisely the Americans had decoded his aircraft's movements, the discovery loop tightened around him, setting the stage for encounters he would never fully understand until it was far too late. As the weeks progressed, the quiet effectiveness of the hidden Gunsight modification spread through the American squadrons, with the steady inevitability of a secret whispered from one trusted pilot to another. It began with a handful of Sabre veterans who shared their experiences during late evening debriefs, describing how the subtle adjustment to their aiming system transformed chaotic dogfights into controlled engagements where precision replaced desperation. These conversations, spoken softly over cooling engines and dimly lit briefing tables, ignited a curiosity that quickly evolved into a determined effort to replicate the results across multiple flights. Crew chiefs took notice when pilots returned with unusually efficient ammunition usage, reporting confirmed hits delivered in shorter bursts and at angles traditionally considered unfavorable for the F-86. The maintenance teams, always eager to enhance reliability and performance, examined the modified gun sights and found the changes remarkably simple, requiring only minor recalibration and a few minutes of careful adjustment. Within days, the technique spread from a single aircraft to an entire flight, each pilot eager to experience the uncanny responsiveness that seemed to merge sight, instinct, and machine into a single fluid motion. By mid-month, squadron leaders recognized the dramatic shift unfolding beneath their command, observing a consistent rise in successful engagements, paired with a noticeable decrease in pilot fatigue and ammunition expenditure. Instead of relying on brute maneuvering or extended rolling contests, the Sabres now engaged with confident bursts, timed precisely to exploit the MiG's inevitable moment of hesitation. This new efficiency freed pilots from the exhausting dogfights that had defined earlier months in MiG Alley, allowing them to strike decisively before disengaging to regroup and prepare for the next encounter. The transformation spread further when flight instructors integrated the modified gunsight technique into unofficial training sessions, framing it not as a replacement for standard doctrine, but as an enhancement that synchronized perfectly with the Sabre's natural flight characteristics. Trainees learned to watch for the subtle cues that signaled a MiG's upcoming maneuver, trusting the gunsight to translate their predictions into accurate firing solutions. This fusion of human intuition and mechanical precision created a new tactical rhythm that elevated the entire unit's performance without ever appearing in formal manuals or official briefings. Even the wing commanders, known for their caution regarding unauthorized changes, quietly accepted the modification after reviewing combat footage showing clean, controlled intercepts against MiGs that previously required dangerous rolling pursuits. They recognized that the battlefield was evolving faster than administrative protocols, and the hidden gunsight provided an advantage too significant to ignore, especially in a theater where even a fraction of a second could determine the outcome of a pilot's final maneuver. The change became an open secret, acknowledged informally, ignored officially, but embraced wholeheartedly by every pilot who entered the unforgiving skies along the Yalu River. By late November, the modification had become so widespread within the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing that new arrivals assumed it was part of the standard configuration, unaware of the improvised origins or the handful of mechanics who first conceived it. The Americans now executed engagements with a confidence that felt almost surgical, striking with precision that baffled every MiG pilot caught in their sights. And as Yuri continued patrolling the gray corridors of MiG Alley, the unseen network of adjustments and shared insights across the Sabre squadrons closed around him like an invisible web, reshaping the entire balance of the air war without a single official order ever being issued. As the modified gunsights became quietly standardized across the Sabre squadrons, the statistical patterns emerging in combat reports painted a picture far more dramatic than any pilot initially realized. Engagement logs from multiple wings showed a consistent rise in successful intercepts, with Sabre pilots achieving firing solutions earlier and at angles previously considered too narrow or unstable for reliable accuracy. These numbers, once scattered and unpredictable, now formed clean upward trends that aligned perfectly with the timing of the unofficial modifications circulating through the maintenance bays. Analysts at the American Forward Operations Center noticed this shift, When reviewing gun camera footage that revealed MiGs being struck at the precise moment their roll hesitation peaked, often before the Soviet pilots even recognized they were exposed. The footage demonstrated bursts landing exactly along predicted flight arcs, indicating a level of anticipatory targeting unheard of in traditional dogfighting. This improvement could not be attributed to random luck or veteran skill alone, since even newer pilots displayed similar performance gains after receiving the adjusted gun sights. Further validation came from mission debriefings, where pilots described engagements unfolding with a fluid predictability that contrasted sharply with the frantic, uncertain duels of earlier months. Instead of extended turning fights that strained aircraft and exhausted pilots, the Sabres now resolved encounters in short, disciplined exchanges that lasted mere seconds but carried decisive impact. These clean intercepts, repeated across dozens of sorties, produced loss ratios that raised eyebrows among intelligence officers accustomed to far tighter margins between American and Soviet aircraft. Meanwhile, Soviet ground stations monitoring radar tracks began to notice unfamiliar patterns in the Sabres' attack profiles, observing that American aircraft no longer relied solely on climbing or diving tactics to dictate engagements. Instead, Sabres approached from varied angles, often intercepting MiGs during transitional phases that had traditionally provided Soviet pilots with defensive leverage. These deviations unsettled analysts who believed the Americans lacked the agility to exploit such narrow windows, forcing them to reconsider earlier assumptions regarding the Sabres' true performance capabilities. As these anomalies accumulated, Soviet squadron commanders filed increasingly urgent inquiries, questioning why MiG pilots appeared to be losing engagements even when entering battles with altitude superiority and numerical advantage. Reports described situations where MiGs executed standard maneuvers flawlessly, yet still found themselves struck by bursts, timed too precisely to be coincidence. Some pilots insisted the Americans had acquired a new radar-assisted gunsight, while others speculated about improvements to the Sabre's airframe, though none of these theories fully accounted for the consistent timing of the intercepts. Back in the American command tents, analysts quietly compiled comparative data showing that the ratio of successful Sabre engagements had doubled within a span of several weeks, with peak performance correlating directly to units known to have adopted the modification earliest. These calculations, never released in official communiques, affirmed what pilots already sensed in the air. The balance of power in MiG Alley had shifted decisively, not through sweeping technological breakthroughs, but through a precise adjustment that amplified every tactical insight gained on the battlefield. By early winter, the evidence had become impossible to ignore. The Sabres were winning not because they flew faster or climbed higher, but because their shots landed exactly when and where the MiGs became briefly vulnerable. The hidden gunsight had transformed these fleeting moments into opportunities for decisive advantage, validating its subtle influence across every encounter, and ensuring that each duel began with the Americans possessing a predictive edge the Soviets could neither detect nor counter. In the months that followed, the tactical ripple created by the hidden gunsight extended far beyond the immediate victories recorded along the Yalu River, gradually reshaping the theoretical foundations of post-war aerial combat. American engineers studying the gun camera reels recognized that the modification had done more than simply enhance accuracy. It had demonstrated how micro-adjustments to targeting systems could fundamentally alter the tempo of a duel, allowing pilots to convert fleeting aerodynamic cues into actionable firing solutions. This insight marked a decisive break from earlier doctrines that viewed dogfighting as a contest of speed, altitude, and raw maneuvering power, rather than timing, prediction, and precision mechanics. As the footage circulated through research divisions, designers responsible for the next generation of fighters began to rethink how pilots interfaced with their aircraft, shifting focus towards systems that anticipated rather than reacted. The subtle delay that once plagued many World War II-era gunsights was now seen as an unacceptable handicap, prompting engineers to prioritize responsive integration between pilot input, weapon computation, and aircraft movement. This shift eventually informed the development of more advanced lead computing gunsights, which replaced the older analog systems with faster, more predictive mechanisms capable of adjusting in real time to rapid changes in relative position. Combat instructors also recognized the broader implications of the Sabre's success, noting how predictive targeting had allowed pilots to control engagement geometry rather than simply endure it. Training programs soon incorporated new modules emphasizing micro-cue recognition, encouraging pilots to study the smallest aerodynamic signals such as wing tilt, nose dip, or throttle surge to forecast an opponent's intentions before the first turn even began. This approach marked a dramatic departure from the rigid maneuver sequences previously taught, fostering a more fluid, adaptive mindset that aligned closely with the lessons learned in MiG Alley. Furthermore, the tactical reports demonstrated that even a modest enhancement to weapon responsiveness could allow fighters to compete effectively against opponents with superior climb performance or raw engine power. This finding encouraged designers to explore improvements in avionics and fire control integration, ultimately contributing to the conceptual groundwork for systems like radar-assisted gun sights and early analog computers that later defined aircraft such as the F-100 Super Sabre and the F-4 Phantom. These machines embodied the principle that victory increasingly depended on harmonizing pilot intuition with predictive technology, rather than relying solely on brute performance. On a broader strategic level, the hidden gunsight underscored how real-world battlefield improvisation could outpace formal research and development, highlighting the importance of field-level innovation within frontline units. Military planners began encouraging greater collaboration between pilots, engineers, and maintenance crews, recognizing that small insights gathered in combat often revealed critical deficiencies or untapped strengths invisible in controlled test environments. This philosophy eventually shaped the culture of multiple air wings, reinforcing the idea that adaptability and experimentation were essential qualities for any force seeking sustained superiority. For the veterans who flew over MiG Alley, the legacy of the hidden gunsight remained less about technological triumph and more about the quiet brilliance of understanding an enemy's rhythm. They carried forward the knowledge that even the most advanced aircraft possessed subtle patterns that, once decoded, could shift an entire conflict's balance. And although the modification never appeared in official manuals or public records, its influence echoed through every gunsight, fire control system, and tactical syllabus developed in the decades that followed, ensuring that the lessons born from those gray skies continued shaping the future of aerial warfare long after the dogfights had faded into history. Amid the sweeping tactical shifts and technological breakthroughs credited to the Sabre's growing dominance, the true origin of the hidden gunsight could be traced back to a single maintenance tent tucked behind a row of fuel trucks at Kimpo Air Base. Inside that dim canvas shelter, Master Sergeant Daniel Harlow spent long nights hunched over open gunsight housings, guided less by official directives and more by an almost stubborn curiosity about why his pilots struggled to land clean bursts during close engagements. Harlow had no grand vision of altering aerial warfare. He simply refused to accept that a fraction of a second's delay dismissed in the manuals as insignificant should dictate whether a pilot returned home or disappeared into the gray horizon. Over countless evenings punctuated by the hum of generators and the distant rumble of returning patrols, Harlow tested minor adjustments that stiffened the internal gyros and reduced slack in the gunsight linkage, performing each modification with the patience of a craftsman rather than the urgency of a mechanic in a war zone. He recorded nothing in formal logs, knowing the adjustments technically violated maintenance protocols, yet he trusted his intuition more than the procedures, written thousands of miles away by engineers who had never experienced the chaotic turbulence of MiG Alley. His work remained invisible to everyone except the pilots who noticed the gunsight responding with a clarity that felt immediately different the moment they squeezed the trigger. One of these pilots, Lieutenant Howard Briggs, returned from a mission visibly shaken after landing a perfectly timed burst on a MiG that had appeared only briefly through the clouds. When he described how the gunsight felt alive in his hands, Harlow realized the significance of what he had created, though he lacked the language to explain it technically. He knew only that the adjustment transformed instinct into precision, allowing the aircraft to mirror the pilot's intent with a smoothness that bordered on intuitive. Briggs shared the experience with his wingmates, and soon Harlow found himself performing the same quiet modification on aircraft across the flight line, without ever acknowledging his role openly. Despite his growing influence, Harlow remained painfully aware that his improvisation carried risks, both mechanical and bureaucratic, and he often questioned whether he should reveal his method to senior officers. Yet every time he watched pilots dismount, after successful sorties exhausted but alive, he reaffirmed his choice to keep the adjustment unofficial, protected from committees that might delay or reject it due to procedural rigidity. His satisfaction came not from recognition but from the quiet understanding that he had tilted the odds in his pilots' favor, offering them a tool refined by battlefield necessity rather than theoretical doctrine. When the results eventually reached the attention of wing commanders, the modification had already taken on a life of its own, spreading through informal channels and leaving no clear record of its true origin. Harlow never pushed for acknowledgement, nor did he expect any, choosing instead to remain behind the rows of aircraft, where he could continue refining his work without interruption. By the war's end, few outside his immediate circle even knew his name, and none could trace the decisive shift in Sabre performance back to his small bench, cluttered with tools and stripped components. Yet every Sabre that returned safely carried a fragment of Harlow's intuition within its gunsight, a quiet testament to the power of human ingenuity operating far from the spotlight. While history celebrated pilots, commanders, and aircraft, the airmen who understood the truth often spoke of an unnamed mechanic whose hands reshaped the very rhythm of aerial combat through an adjustment small enough to fit between his fingertips. When the guns finally fell silent and the jets no longer carved white scars across the sky, Yuri returned to a world that felt strangely distant from the cold metal cockpit where he had spent most of his youth. The war had ended not with a triumphant victory or a decisive defeat, but with an uneasy pause that left pilots from both sides carrying questions heavier than the aircraft they once flew. Yuri struggled to reconcile the quiet streets of his hometown with the relentless tension of MiG Alley, where every cloud might conceal a Sabre streaking into a perfect firing angle he never fully understood. In the months that followed, he often replayed those encounters in his mind, searching for clues he might have missed, trying to identify the moment when the Americans gained an advantage so subtle that few Soviet pilots recognized it until it was too late. During official interviews, he repeated the standard explanations: radio interference, pilot error, unpredictable tactics, but privately, he suspected there was something deeper behind the Sabre's uncanny precision. His comrades shared the same uneasy feeling, each describing moments when they felt as though the Americans anticipated their every movement, despite approaching from angles that defied conventional doctrine. Life after the war moved slowly, and Yuri found work as a flight instructor, teaching young cadets who listened eagerly to stories about the MiG-15 and the unforgiving skies of Korea. Yet each time he demonstrated a maneuver or diagrammed a roll turn on the chalkboard, he remembered how those same movements had once revealed hidden vulnerabilities exploited by an opponent he never fully comprehended. He taught his students the standard curriculum, but occasionally he added small warnings, quiet notes about timing, anticipation, and the danger of trusting manuals more than instinct. His superiors rarely noticed these deviations, yet the cadets did, sensing that his advice carried the weight of lessons learned in fear rather than theory. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the pilots who had benefited from Harlow's hidden modification returned to civilian life with stories they rarely shared, choosing instead to focus on families, careers, and a world eager to forget the tension that once hummed through the skies above the Yalu River. Many never learned who improved their gun sights or why their aircraft suddenly felt sharper, more responsive, and inexplicably aligned with their instincts during the most critical moments. To them, the air war's turning point became a memory defined by intuition rather than science, a feeling that the Sabre simply clicked when they needed it most. In time, engineers would analyze data from the conflict and publish technical papers describing advances in predictive targeting, though none mentioned the nameless mechanic whose late-night adjustments quietly shaped those breakthroughs. In that stillness, Yuri understood that the legacy of MiG Alley lived not in victories or defeats, but in the people who learned to adapt, improvise, and survive within a world defined by fractions of seconds and unseen hands. And as he turned away from the exhibit, he carried with him a final realization: the skies had changed forever, shaped as much by hidden ingenuity as by the pilots who rode the thin line between life and loss. In the long, quiet years that followed, the lessons of MiG Alley drifted into memory, yet their echoes remained etched into the minds of everyone who once carved contrails across that gray, merciless sky. Historians would later argue over numbers, tactics, and technological superiority, creating tidy narratives that tried to explain the unpredictable rhythm of those engagements, but none of their diagrams captured the raw uncertainty that defined each duel. The truth lived in smaller moments, those fractions of seconds when a pilot sensed danger before seeing it, or when a mechanic followed intuition instead of orders, altering the course of a battle without ever stepping into the cockpit. Yuri eventually came to understand that wars were shaped less by sweeping strategies and more by countless invisible threads woven by ordinary people who refused to accept the limitations placed before them. He realized that every pilot carried both pride and doubt, knowing that survival depended not only on skill but also on the unseen choices of others working quietly behind the scenes. The hidden gun sight, which once seemed like an impossible mystery, became a symbol of how innovation often emerged from necessity rather than ambition, created by hands seeking to protect rather than dominate. As Yuri watched younger generations marvel at restored aircraft in museums, he felt a quiet sense of connection between the machines that once threatened his life and the people who flew them with a mixture of fear, determination, and hope. Those gleaming artifacts no longer represented enemies or allies. They stood as reminders that every conflict carried human stories far more complex than the victories or losses recorded in official summaries. He understood that the pilots who once opposed him were driven by the same instincts to return home alive, to protect their comrades, and to make sense of a world that demanded impossible choices from those who served. The legacy of MiG Alley, he realized, was not defined by which aircraft climbed higher or turned sharper, but by the human capacity to learn in the midst of chaos, to adapt when established doctrine failed, and to find meaning in the thin space between life and loss. It taught him that progress often came from quiet acts of defiance, from those willing to question assumptions and experiment with ideas that felt too small to matter until they reshaped the sky itself. Standing beside the cold aluminum fuselage of a preserved MiG-15, Yuri rested his hand against the smooth surface and imagined the countless decisions, large and small, that had carried him through the war. He thought of the American pilots who once chased him through the clouds, the mechanic whose name he never learned, and the countless others whose insights shaped a battlefield neither side fully understood at the time. Their stories intertwined like contrails fading into the wind, leaving behind a legacy defined not by triumph or defeat, but by resilience, ingenuity, and the stubborn will to survive. As he stepped away from the aircraft and walked toward the museum exit, he carried with him a final understanding that transcended national borders and historical debates. In the end, the sky belonged not to the fastest machines or the most powerful nations, but to the people who dared to challenge the limits placed before them. The war had ended long ago, yet its lessons endured in every pilot who trusted intuition over fear, every engineer who questioned conventional wisdom, and every quiet mechanic who tightened a bolt or adjusted a dial, knowing even the smallest change might save a life. And as Yuri disappeared into the afternoon light, he understood that the true legacy of MiG Alley lived on in those unseen hands, shaping the future long after the last jet had vanished beyond the horizon.